The entire central part of the United States, all the way down to the Gulf Coast of Texas, was 40 and 50 degrees below an average high temperature during that time of the year for that day. Slide 4 really has some interesting weather tidbits in terms of the historic nature and the severity of this storm. We were below freezing for 13 straight days in Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and Wichita, or Oklahoma City and Dallas set their second coldest ever temperature records, second to the February 1899 winter weather events. It was below 20 degrees for 10 consecutive days in Wichita, which is, again, second only to that February 1899 event. You can see there were 3,000 daily temperature records broken, 76 all-time temperature records broken. And that's a quote. That last bullet point is a quote directly from the from NOAA's Weather Prediction Center, and their overview of the event, which they called the most extreme cold weather event in the Southern Great Plains since February 12th, 1899. So the impact of all that extreme cold weather and the duration, probably more importantly, of the storm, really had major effects on supply and demand for both electricity and natural gas during this period of time. So SPP set a new all-time peak, winter peak demand record on February 15th of 43,661 megawatts. It's important to point out that peak was set during a period of time in which there were widespread public calls for conservation. So every SPP member utility since at least Sunday evening was requesting conservation, and those efforts were successful because SPP predicted that their load would have been 47,000 megawatts during that period of time. ERCOT as well set a new all-time winter peak electricity demand on the 14th of February. Of course, we know the history of what occurred in the days subsequent to that, in that ERCOT went into a period of time of shedding significant amounts of load, up to 20,000 megawatts for 3 consecutive days. And so ultimately they didn't meet what would have been their next highest peak load, but that they would have beaten that peak again the next day. And then on the next slide, slide 6, I just go into, it's a graphical representation of how high demand was for natural gas during this period of time. So we didn't hit a new national record demand for natural gas for a one-day demand record. We're just under 2% below that, but there was a new 2-day record for natural gas demand. And then in the entire central mid-continent portion of the United States and in Texas, both of those areas set new single-day natural gas demand records. And of course, the demand for natural gas during extreme cold weather like that is for 2 purposes, right? It's for home and business heating purposes, for natural gas furnaces, but also industrial processes, and in particular, the production of electricity through natural gas-fired generating units. So on slide 7, we talk about, in the face of this extreme demand for natural gas and electricity, what was the supply situation? What did that look like? Well, so there were record declines in the short-term production of natural gas during this period of time, right? There was overall in the lower 48, natural gas production declined by 28% from February 8th through February 17th. That's the largest monthly decline on record. And you can see on the third bullet point there, I've got some of the specific figures that came out of the FERC-NERC report that was recently released, in which natural gas production and processing declined by 70% in Texas during this period of time, 56% in Oklahoma. Louisiana had significant declines, and as well as we did in Kansas. So if you look at it on a monthly basis, natural gas production declined by just under 22% in the month of February in Kansas compared to January of 2021, which really had pretty normal weather. If you look at that last bullet point there, and there's actually a slide later in the deck that shows this graphically, but that last bullet point refers to some information that was presented in the Kansas Gas Service company-specific investigation at the KCC, and that's information that that KGS's consultant pulled from their third-party production database, and which shows that Kansas's natural gas production receipts into interstate pipelines dropped by 45% during this period of time. So the next couple slides, slides 8 and 9, really just show the story graphically of what we've already talked about. Slide 8, more of the national, the lower 48 states, national view of what happened to natural gas supply during this period of time. And then on slide 9, it's broken out separately between production and processing in just the event area. And this is a graphic that came out of the FERC-NERC report. And so this presents natural gas production and processing in the entire area of SPP, ERCOT, and MISO South. And so you can see that during the worst of the event, there were severe declines in natural gas production and processing. But another notable observation, I think, from these graphs is you can see how resilient of a resource it was in that, later in that month when temperatures warmed and became more seasonable, natural gas production levels came right back up to where they were at the beginning of the month of February. Slide 10 is just that Kansas-specific view by pipeline. And again, I have the source of where the information came from there in the slide. And it shows a nearly 50% reduction in the production of natural gas in Kansas during this period of time. So the results of record high demand and record short-term declines in production typically ends up being high prices. And in this case, it was high prices and then some. So what I've done on slide 11 there is a sort of a cross-section of some of the highest price wholesale natural gas levels that were identified during this time frame. And so and they were, I say identified, that were published by S&P Global Platts. So S&P Global Platts, the Gas Daily Index, is by far and away the most heavily represented, heavily utilized gas index to buy and sell natural gas across the United States. And they calculate and publish these indexes very region specific and geographic specific. And so, if you look at some of those numbers, you can see that, gas going into Chicago City Gate was, 10 times higher than it had ever been. And it was extremely high in Houston and Southern California, but the entire central part of the United States. And when that production decline bled out into the market centers of east and west of us, they also experienced severe wholesale natural gas prices. The national average price for this day was $57.74 across every MMBTU of gas traded that S&P Global Platts Gas Daily tracks. That was a record, and it was broken the next day on gas day 17. I should have mentioned the previous slide. All of those gas index prices were for the 4-day weekend of February 13th through the 16th. And we know that that's because on Monday, that was a federal holiday. Organized financial exchanges were closed that day. And so gas traders purchased their gas on Friday for that 4-day weekend. So slide 12 is really just a repeat of the previous, but it's with gas day 17. This is the worst of the event from a pricing perspective. It also coincided with the worst of the event from a production and processing standpoint, the decline in natural gas production in the central part of the United States. as bad as it was in Kansas, and it was bad, Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, was actually hit much, much worse. The One Oak trading hub in Tulsa, Oklahoma is a highly liquid, heavily utilized trading hub for natural gas by everybody that uses natural gas, from utilities, electric utilities, et cetera. When our price got to $622.79 on February 17th on the Central Star natural gas pipeline, Oklahoma's price was $944. It actually got worse the next day on February 18th. It closed at almost $1,200 an MMBTU. That pricing, for context, you guys have probably heard some of these numbers, but there were the month ahead, first of the month, gas contract price for the Southern Star Index for February of 2021 was $2.54 an MMBTU. So we're talking about, prices that are 250 times, 300 times normal during this period of time. I guess one of the only bright spots for Kansas was that on February 18th, the day that prices were spiking even higher in Oklahoma, the majority of gas index prices that serve Kansas utilities came back down to still astronomical, but more heard of type record levels of $44 an MMBTU. So on slide 13, we're starting to talk about the impact of URI on wholesale electric supply. In SPP supply, we had over 30,000 megawatts of electric generating capacity that was offline during its worst, during the worst of the event. That's 33% of the capacity. In ERCOT, it was worse, almost 50,000 megawatts of generating capacity that was offline, or almost 40%. And predictably, as we can see in the next slide, slide 14, record high demand, new peaks for electricity demand, and significant declines, short-term declines in electricity supply, as well as record high natural gas prices led to record high wholesale electricity prices. So the day ahead and real-time market prices in the integrated marketplace both hit their all-time high during this event, over $4,000 a megawatt hour. For context, I have a calculation there, it's back of the envelope, but reliable, that's roughly $4 a kilowatt hour, or $130 of wholesale electricity costs per day for a regular residential customer. And so thankfully, most utilities in Kansas did not experience quite that degree of financial impact. There's certainly ways that they had, tools that they had to offset against that. Any of the production that they had online that they were able to sell into the market during this period of time pretty much offset against that financial exposure. And so each individual utility had their own individual experiences based on what units they had online and were capable of providing power. For context, the average day-ahead price in SPP for all of last year was $17.69. So the slide 15 is just a graphical representation of what we've talked about. So on slide 16, so there were natural gas and electric shortages in Kansas. First blow was extremely high wholesale prices. And then there were shortages that were experienced. On the natural gas side, curtailments were, for the most part, for the vast majority of the most part, limited to non-human needs customers, or customers that were on interruptible tariffs that receive a discount in their service in order to be interrupted or called upon during times of system stress. But there were non-human needs transportation customers that were curtailed. Everyone was asked to conserve and cut back at this period of time, especially with regard to natural gas. So for non-human needs customers, businesses were asked to reduce their their natural gas consumption to plant protection levels, to switch fuels if possible. That resulted in some businesses having property damage and lost sales opportunity or product degradation. And so that was an individually those businesses did suffer. But overall, those conservation efforts were what made it possible for human needs customers to maintain natural gas service during the event. There are several examples of where, businesses took actions that were personally harmful to them financially, but those actions contributed to the stability of the overall system and made it possible to continue providing natural gas to human needs customers. And, it's not overstating it to say that that's a matter of life and death during temperatures like that, where it's, below 0 or below 20 degrees for over a week. People freeze to death. People die of carbon dioxide if you lose natural gas service. And so thankfully in Kansas, we didn't experience that. So there were shortages, though, of electricity. On slide 17, there were, for the first time in SPP's history, there were firm load shedding events that occurred. The first of which was just under an hour on Monday, February 15th at 12:04 p.m., lasted 57 minutes and was 1.5% of the load throughout all of SPP. The way those load shed responsibilities are calculated or shared is based on pre-arranged ratios, based on the load that each utility used in the year prior, in the winter prior. So these load shed responsibilities were shared across the entire 14-state region of SPP. So the second load shed that occurred was a little longer and a little more severe duration this time. It was a little over 3 hours and 20 minutes on February 16th. And it was 6.5% of the load through SPP, or 2,700 megawatts. So, a larger load shed event for sure in a longer period of time. And then that last bullet point is just there for context and to remember that, what happened in ERCOT during this event was obviously a much more severe event. 45% of their load, 20,000 megawatts, was shed for 3 consecutive days. So, slide 18 is just a graphical representation of the actual load shed itself, and so on slide 19 we start to get into the causes of natural gas shortages. And in this area, the presentation, we rely pretty heavily on the FERC-NERC report, on the SPP comprehensive review report. We looked at the independent market monitor report from SPP, and also just our own observations from our own investigations. But, beginning as early as February 6th or February 7th, natural gas production facilities either began to freeze in or were preemptively shut in order to prevent imminent freezing issues. Those facilities faced with weather that extreme, if you don't preemptively shut them in, if they're not winter weatherized, you can have severe sort of catastrophic equipment loss that takes a long time to get back from. So natural gas wells also lost power during the event, and that contributed to the decline as well. The FERC-NERC report has a really detailed, analytical evaluation of this on a day-by-day basis. They evaluate it before any firm load shed that occurred in ERCOT or SPP. They evaluate it afterwards. But what on slide 20 is kind of a summary of their overall findings. And overall, during the entirety of the event, from February 8th through the 20th, they attribute freezing issues, winter weather, cold weather generally, to 58% of the decline of natural gas production during this event, and 23.5% of the decline is attributable to lost power. Now, they were careful to say that, because regular winter weather storm-related power outages were occurring at the same time as firm load shed, that you can't necessarily delineate out between the firm load shed events and just regular power loss due to winter weather events. But of all forms of power loss, it was, just under 24%. And basically slide 21 is just the same, just a graphical representation of the same table to the left. Slide 22 is a little different focus, and it focuses on natural gas processing declines. Again, there's an analysis, a daily analysis of this, but from a natural gas processing perspective, FERC attributes just the loss of feedstock of natural gas production for 61% of the declines, freezing issues 13%, loss of power 18%. And that last bullet point on that slide is a quote. I won't read it, but if you basically, what that tells me is, in very clear terms, is that the loss of power production was a much greater issue for the loss of natural gas production in ERCOT than it was in SPP. Right? Although, and I mentioned in the slides, and they mentioned in the FERC-NERC report, while it was a much larger issue in ERCOT, it did occur in SPP, and there were instances that occurred. Slide 23 is another view, a deeper dive that presents the same information, but this time by production basin. And I'll just focus on the Anadarko and Permian production basins, which overlap with the SPP footprint. And if you compare the percentage attribution of loss of production and processing ability in those basins that's attributed to power supply loss compared to the other basins, then that basically confirms the same observation as before, that this was a much larger event in ERCOT than SPP. So guys, gas pipelines on slide 24, gas pipelines did pretty well through the event. Firm transportation was not a guarantee of receiving all of your natural gas for electric generating purposes, because natural gas was being restricted for human needs customers or non-human needs customers. But gas pipelines were minimally affected by power outages, and for the most part, they performed as they were supposed to. So if you talk to the big natural gas interstate pipelines that serve this area, they set new all-time throughput production records day after day after day during this event. But that being said, there were shortages. I mean, there simply were not enough molecules of natural gas to provide for all of home and business heating purposes, electric generating purposes. So there were shortages on the pipeline. There was operational flow orders issued and emergency flow orders and force majeures, but for the most part, they operated as they were designed and built. Gas storage, there's some specifics on slide 25. Natural gas storage was one of the real success stories in this event. The reliability couldn't have been provided that was without natural gas storage. Utilities that relied on it heavily, experienced significant offset to the financial detriment that other utilities that didn't have as much storage weren't able to experience. So storage as well set several all-time records during the event. All right. Slide 26, we start to talk about some of the causes of the electricity shortages during the event. So again, these slides, most of these come directly out of the FERC-NERC report or the SPP report. First, we can look at, for slide 26 is across the entire event area, SPP, MISO, and ERCOT. You have freezing issues and mechanical and electrical issues, which were positively correlated with the cold weather. So, while fuel supply and in particular natural gas fuel supply issues got a lot of focus in SPP, and it was the largest single cause of what we dealt with in SPP, across the central part of the United States, fuel issues were only responsible for 31% of the generating outages that we had. The rest of it was freezing or mechanical and electrical issues. On slide 27, These are electricity shortages by fuel type. So the way this information is presented is it's cumulative in terms of total capacity that was unavailable during the event. So if you had a 100 megawatt simple cycle combustion turbine and it was unavailable for 6 days, then it shows up as 600 megawatts of unavailability in the gas column. You can see there were more gas generation outages during this period of time than any other fuel type, second to wind, and then third to coal at 18%. And just interestingly and quickly, the freezing issues and lack of winterization were a much larger issue in ERCOT than they were in SPP. Okay, so if you look at the FERC-NERC report, page 123, you'll see the fuel supply issues in ERCOT peaked at 7,700 megawatts. Okay, there's only 7,700 megawatts that were out from fuel supply issues, but they had almost 30,000 megawatts out at one point at their worst time for freezing issues. So, and that's actually, that ratio is the opposite in SPP. So for natural gas units in SPP, 72% of the outages that occurred with natural gas units were natural gas fuel supply issues. So there just wasn't enough commodity for them to run full out, so they derated their units. Next two slides, 28 and 29, are a different view. They're still event-wide, so these are SPP, MISO, and ERCOT. But you can see a couple things, especially if you compare those two slides to each other. You can see that in early morning hours of February 15th, over midnight, going into the day, there was a dramatic uptick of natural gas units that began to be unavailable in ERCOT. I mean, as many as 25,000 megawatts of natural gas that suddenly came offline in a 12-hour period of time. And while the slide on 28 doesn't show that, you can tell that by looking at slide 29, because the SPP generating unavailability is relatively plateaued, and it just absolutely spikes in ERCOT. But it's a different view. On slide 30, this is a graphical representation of where we experienced generating outages throughout the central part of the United States. We were able to get this graphic from the authors of the FERC-NERC report because the actual graphic in the report cuts off just below Kansas. You can see it there by fuel type. So slide 31, we're shifting over now to more SPP-specific findings. This is from the SPP Winter Weather Event Report. They cite fuel supply as 47% of their outages. It's the largest single cause. My note there is it's the largest single cause, but it's less than half of the actual incidences. So freezing also was an issue in SPP with as high as up to 12,500 units out from freezing. At the worst of their outages and the most, when electricity supply was the scarcest on February 16th, out of 30,500 megawatts of outaged capacity, 18,000 of that was natural gas fired generation, and 72% of that cited fuel supply as the reason for the outage. There were freezing issues throughout SPP, and we'll get into some of it in these next slides. Wind turbines experienced cold weather shutoff. A lot of these turbines have a minimum ambient temperature operating limitation. So below -4 or -13, they're manufactured and designed to shut off in order to not do permanent long-term damage to the equipment. And that happened. They also experienced blade icing to a significant degree earlier on in the event, up to 10,000 megawatts of wind offline during certain times of the event. We also had coal units in Kansas that experienced freezing issues. There were frozen coal pile issues, mainly pertaining to, they had low coal inventory going into the event in times. It wasn't properly sloped because of that the low coal piles and difficulties with rail traffic going into the units. So there were, this was an extreme winter weather event, and it affected all types of electric generation during the event. So slides 32 and 33 are again, SPP specific focus. If you focus on those and look by fuel type, you can see that, wind predominantly, there were more outages, wind outages early on in the event, and that sort of stayed pretty well constant until until some of the coldest air of the event came in, and then it got a little bit better, but still stayed 8,000 megawatts out. What you see there's very few outages that occurred with coal during this period of time. Natural gas, on the other hand, mainly due to fuel supply issues, really it did struggle. Their outages, 75% of which were just lack of supply, and their outages sort of crept up generally throughout the event. The same information really that's presented on 33, but this is by cause code. But what you can do on slide 33 is the yellow and the blue cause codes are equipment failure or regulatory safety, environmental, and there isn't a freezing cause code, but basically those two cause codes are what makes up freezing issues. And then the big middle issue is fuel supply, the vast majority of which were natural gas units. Okay. Slide 34 is just a sort of a reminder of, from a capacity and energy perspective and nameplate capacity perspective in SPP. So from a nameplate capacity perspective, there's almost 30,000 megawatts of wind in SPP, but from a winter accredited capacity perspective, wind is only 6.7% of the capacity that keeps the lights on in the winter. So in other words, 83% of the capacity, the accredited winter capacity in SPP is either coal or natural gas. And 48% of the capacity that SPP relies on to provide energy during the winter is natural gas fired. And so if you look, the next three slides, 35, 36, and 37 shows how wind and coal and gas performed during the event. And you can see what their relative availability was and what their relative capacity, what the energy that they provided, how that compares to the capacity that they were accredited at. And I'm not going to point out any of the specific findings from those slides due to just our time here today. But then if you look at slides 38 and 39, this is sort of, in my mind at least, one of the big picture takeaways, which is, so we've talked about what units experienced outages and what wasn't available during the event. But I think the fair side of the other side of the coin is, well, what units did provide the energy that kept the lights on during this period of time, right? And you can see that coal and natural gas during the most severe periods of this event provided 70% of the electricity that kept the lights on. Actually, imports into SPP from MISO and PJM were critically important as well. And if we're being honest, we're in large part what separated SPP from ERCOT is the ability to bring in 6,000 megawatts of power at a time when we were short on our own. Slide 39 is that same, basically that same data, but for Evergy. This comes from their hourly energy production data that we gathered during our investigation. They're a little more coal heavy and nuclear heavy than the footprint as a whole. And so, you can see that for coal and nuclear provided almost 80% of the capacity, the energy that Evergy put onto the grid during this period of time. Their natural gas and wind were down around 7% each. Slides 40 and 41 are just the importance of imports during Uri. I mentioned that, how critical they were to our reliability during this period of time. And if you look at those graphs closely, what you can see is while we were able to import power into SPP from MISO and PJM, SPP was able to keep the lights on. But when those RTOs experienced their own shortages and transmission limitations, then they had to call that power back, and that's when we experienced rolling load sheds. So these are, next couple slides just go into the specifics of the KCC proceedings so far, and how we responded to the event, the emergency order that we issued Monday morning, February 15th. And the fact that we opened individual company-specific investigations into each one of these companies, and what we're looking at, and what the objective of those proceedings are. Slide 44 and 45 provide some more of the specific details about the costs by different gas and electric utilities that they incurred during this period of time for wholesale electricity and gas costs. One of the primary objectives of the emergency order that we issued is, the KCC took a stance early on and said, we know that wholesale electricity and gas prices are sky high, and they're they're at unprecedented levels. But whatever you do, take whatever lawful necessary step is necessary to keep the light and the heat on during this event. And we'll worry about the financial ramifications afterwards. And so that's basically that emergency order on Monday, February 15th, just clarified that for everybody. And one of the requirements was that the utilities had to provide a compliance plan and a plan to basically spread out the cost of this winter weather event over time. And the specifics of all of that is there. Slide 46 talks about a waiver proceeding that KGS has before the commission right now regarding penalties to their transportation customers. I won't go into very much detail at all about that, in part because that's an active proceeding pending before the KCC, and we actually have hearings next week on that. So lessons learned, I'm going to sort of shortcut this here, but lessons learned on page 47 and 48, this is lessons learned on the gas side. And what became obvious during this event is that, and I have, for each of the major gas utilities, or each of the gas utilities, I have what the overall cost of gas was for that month of February on a dollars per MMBTU basis. And so not every utility in Kansas fared the same. What we found is that diversity really mattered, diversity of suppliers, diversity of transportation systems, hedging, while it didn't protect against the spikes in the daily physical gas market, it did what it was designed to do, which is provide stability in at least a third of the gas that the companies were purchasing during this period of time. And so what you'll see is that a lot of those arrangements that the big gas utilities used in order to minimize or to keep to a reasonable level what their financial exposure was just are not available to smaller utilities. They're expensive, they're complicated to manage, and so it really did make a big difference in terms of how the different utilities were exposed to this event. Slide 48 just shows the different percentage mix of how the big three gas utilities in the state purchased their gas, and it shows that they had balancing purchase strategies. They were pulling out of storage, they were pulling out of long-term contracts at stable prices, but it's that 30 to 40% of their gas costs that they purchased at 200 times the regular price that really impacted our gas utilities. Slide 49 and 50 are about the lessons learned and the recommendations so far from the SPP process. We're participating in that process and would be Look forward to answering any questions about that. Slide 51 are the important recommendations that came out of the NERC-FERC reliability report. They make recommendations for minimum winter weather reliability standards and requirements for generators. Before, they would make recommendations, but they were never requirements. This time, NERC has actually changed, or is in the process of changing the minimum reliability standards for every generating unit in the country to have, winterization packages and to be able to operate in extremely cold temperatures. And then on slide 52, we're going to file this week the result of our first company-specific general investigation into Evergy. And we make several recommendations here that are listed on slide 52, from upgrading wind facilities to provide de-icing capabilities, or to allow for colder weather operation, or additional coal pile winterization techniques, or keeping the large baseload coal plants out of a planned outage going into December, January, and February. And so this is just the first step on a lot of these recommendations. Some of them take time, and there's a lot of cost and economic feasibility and engineering feasibility that still needs to go into these recommendations, but that's our recommendation. And then lastly, slide 53 kind of says, okay, so where do we stand for this current winter, right? NERC and FERC do an annual winter reliability assessment. And as you can imagine, this process changed significantly after Winter Storm Uri last year. They evaluate much more severe scenarios, and this year they basically evaluated a repeat of Winter Storm Uri from last year. So they evaluated that scenario in particular for SPP and MISO and ERCOT. And both MISO and ERCOT, according to this reliability assessment, would have rolling outages again if Uri were to be repeated in SPP. However, things are tight. The reserve margin is 0.8%, and we would still be required to pull in power from our neighbor at 2,000 megawatts from MISO, but that's half of what we pulled in last year during Uri. And this assessment says that we would be able to keep the lights on, unlike MISO and ERCOT for this upcoming winter. So there have been some improvements that SPP has made. There's obviously a lot of work to do still. That's not a reserve margin that makes anybody too terribly comfortable. So okay with that. That's the prepared comments that I made. I'm sorry I rushed through that so quickly, and I'm sorry it took so long. So I certainly look forward to your questions.
No, thank you, Justin. I think I'll open it up to any questions any of the committee members might have on this. It was pretty comprehensive. Anyone? Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going back to slide 10, when we talk about the Kansas natural gas production declines, is this chart saying that WTG Hugoton for some period of time was not servicing at all, where there's no orange on the top of that chart?
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's not deliveries off of the pipeline, but that's production receipts into the pipeline. And so that's what it shows, is that it's a little less than a tenth of a BCF per day under normal production, and during that period of time, for it looks like 1 or 2 days, there was no natural gas being put into that pipeline. Full disclosure, I haven't personally audited the data that came from. That's why I listed the source there as where it came from. But I will say it's consistent with what I've seen reported in other publications.
Any other questions? Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellent report. I saw something in here, and I can't find it now, that mentioned Eskridge.
Oh, yeah.
And why is Eskridge, what was special about Eskridge during its charge, what natural gas was charged to them, and how they paid that back?
So the city of Eskridge is they're interesting in that they're still jurisdictional to the KCC, and it's because of, it's because of the statute that more than 40% of their customers are further than 3 miles outside the city limits, right? And so, but anyway, their natural gas supplier is Kansas Municipal Energy Agency, or KMGA. And, KMGA, as you all know, you've heard from them, they represent a lot of municipal customers in the state, and I think they did an admirable job. They did the best that they could, but they got caught up in this event like everybody else, and they were quite exposed to the daily physical gas market during this period of time. And so, I looked into the costs of what it took to supply natural gas for the city of Eskridge and recommended that the commission allow them to recover those costs. I don't think there was anything imprudent going on. It just was, it was an unfortunate event. But they incurred over $1,000 of natural gas costs per customer during this period of time, right? So it really was extreme impact for that city. They took advantage of the legislature of the law, the low interest municipal loan program. They're paying that bill off over 10 years. And it's quite a significant impact on an individual customer by customer basis, even financing it over that period of time. So they were certainly one of the worst hit small utilities that's regulated by the KCC.
Mr. Chairman, quick thought. Are there any other small municipalities or utilities that are in this same category?
The city of, or no other cities, they're the only municipality that we regulate, but American Energy's gas service is a small utility in central and eastern Kansas, in the Mack County area. They have 186 customers. They are served primarily by local, exclusively by local natural gas production. They're on a gathering system. And basically what happened to them is they have an emergency supply agreement to be able to pull in energy basically in the event that it occurs and their local wells are not able to keep up the production for their customers, then they have an emergency supply agreement with KMEA that basically says, we will procure gas for you and we'll sell it to you for what our costs are. It's just an emergency sharing, agreement. And basically, they started losing their wells and their production February 6th, 7th, 8th, and it just got to the point where they had to buy gas off of the market. And it was off of Southern Star Central Gas Pipeline at gas daily index prices. And so they too were severely impacted as a result of this event. I mean, we're talking about $252,000 of natural gas costs for 186 customers. So it was extreme. We have approved their plan for recovery. They were able to secure private financing for a 5-year repayment plan. And because they're small enough, they tracked people's actual usage of gas during this period of time, and they assigned their individual actual usage, what their costs were, and customers have the option to pay it all off or to pay it back over a 5-year period of time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Francisco, do you have one?
I did have one more question, and it's just clearly there were record high natural gas prices because of supply and demand, but has the KCC looked at those prices, whether any of them were exorbitant or price gouging? Is there any effort to look at that part of the concern?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is our ability to look into that is very limited, right? I mean, natural gas is a deregulated wholesale commodity price, and I know that those sort of market manipulation inquiries are occurring at FERC, And they may be occurring at other, through other state investigations or otherwise pursuant to the Consumer Protection Act. But our ability to do that kind of review is extremely limited because the people that we would have to request the information from, they're not public utilities and they don't have any responsibility to respond to discovery requests of ours or otherwise. I mean, most of the gas prices that gas utilities in Kansas and electric utilities incurred are just based on an index price. They made a arm's length agreement to say, I will buy natural gas from you at whatever price is printed in that publication on that day. And it ended up being as high as it was. There were fixed price transactions that occurred as well. And so in each one of these individual investigations, our primary view is saying, when you paid a fixed price, did you pay a price that was competitive with the index that you otherwise would have paid, right? But there certainly there were entities that sold gas during this period of time, marketers and otherwise, that made a lot of money, right? And those some of those are publicly traded firms that had to report that on their publicly reported financial statements. And there's a list of who these suppliers were. It's not necessarily a mystery as to who these suppliers were, but whether or not, what their cost basis was and whether there were markups that were occurring, all of those questions are sort of beyond our purview.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I got two questions. One, I was wondering, with the recommendations that was given in here, does anybody monitor them and report, who watches the recommendations? Do they check the progress? Do they have any conversations with anybody? We can make recommendations, nobody does anything about it, what happens?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Senator. So for any of the recommendations that we made, I'll be responsible for coming back and telling you how those, what the progress of those are and ultimately what happened. The SPP recommendations, I didn't go into a lot of the detail, but they have a specific task force that's supposed to carry out those recommendations. And we have a voting member in Kansas on that task force. She's a former commissioner that served. Sherry Feist Albrecht is our consultant to the SPP working group, and she is involved, and she's a lifelong Kansan. And so, to a certain extent, we're only one or two or three voices in the room. So we're going to do everything we can to ensure that from an SPP perspective, we all have renewed focus and on the importance of reliability and keeping the lights on, right? I think this was sort of a close call in a lot of respects. It wasn't near as bad as what happened in ERCOT, but what happened down there should be a wake-up call for all of us. So there's that. There's a difference between a recommendation and a firm legal requirement, right? And that, I think, is the primary difference that's occurring this year with this event and the NERC standards. Every year NERC has a conference, and they say, we really think you guys should winterize your power plants and do the right thing and have a plan, but there weren't firm legal requirements. But this year, after this event, that's the recommendation now at this point, is for actual mandatory reliability standards for winter weatherization requirements for power plants. And so, I guess we just all have to keep an eye on all of them. And I expect, to be held accountable for at least the recommendations that we made.
My second question, as this report was put together, and from your knowledge and experience of all this, what was some of the big surprises to you that jumped out in this process? Was there any one or two that you were surprised when you seen that information?
Boy, that's a good question. There's a couple of things I was surprised by when I was surprised to see that before I read the FERC-NERC report, which, the final report came out in November, and so, but I've read it cover to cover and spent a lot of time on it since then. But leading up to that, all of the discussion was sort of an SPP focused discussion, and it was all fuel supply, natural gas issues, fuel supply, fuel supply, fuel supply. And almost everything else was sort of, second fiddle. It wasn't a focus for sure. And then you get to the FERC-NERC report and you find out that, well, actually, during every instance, there were more freezing units, there were more freezing issues in SPP and ERCOT than fuel supply issues, and so that's why I pointed out in SPP, the largest single cause of their outages was fuel supply issues, but that's only 47% of the total causes. If you add everything else up, it's all really related to winter weather and cold weather operations, So that was, a major surprise to me. I also, it's also quite interesting, really, when you look at, the reason we presented it the way we did. There are things that went wrong during this event, and then there were things that, that went well. And even despite the fact that there were widespread outages of natural gas units in SPP, for instance, still, right, at the end of the day, firm, dispatchable thermal generation sources provided over 70% of the energy that we all needed during this event. And so I think it's just a wake-up call. It's a warning to us all that we need to make sure that the timing and the pace of a transition, if we go through it, is appropriate, and the technology's there to keep the lights on, because we experienced an inconvenience in Kansas, and we experienced a financial tragedy, right? And there were some businesses that experienced real loss. But in Texas, there was true loss of life. I mean, over 200 people died, right? And that can happen if the electricity goes out for 10 days in 20-degree weather. So, it's just, I don't know. It's been an interesting year spent living and breathing and sleeping this event, but, we're taking it seriously, so.
Any other questions? Yes, Senator Hall.
Just one about whether this is a rare event and whether it is likely to occur again. And you mentioned some things, particularly the winterization standards, as potentially putting us in a better position. Do you think we'll be in a better, what do you think the likelihood is that we might have another Uri type event? And what do you think the likelihood is that we'll be better prepared ahead of time to do the mitigation we need without having some of the inconvenience and financial loss that some businesses faced?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, thanks.
It really is a weatherman question. I should have asked our chair that.
Just a couple things. I mean, I of course have no idea when another polar vortex event like this will occur. I'm sure the chair will tell us that it will occur. There at some point, right? There have been, the FERC-NERC report points out, right? There have been 4 major winter weather events in the last 10 years that have caused some form of bulk electric system instability, right? And so that's a pretty staggering thing, right? I think everybody realizes at this point, we've absolutely got to take this seriously as a country, or these kind of events are going to continue to occur. There are some, this has gotten everybody's focus and attention, and I don't think anybody's shortchanging it. And there are some major tectonic type reforms that are occurring. We've already made some positive changes and reforms. But whether or not, if another Winter Storm Uri event occurs in the first week of February, whether or not we'll experience any firm load shed at all, The reason I left off with that NERC reliability assessment is because they say that we won't, but it will be close, you know? And so we've made some improvements, but some of these things are gonna take time. But on the natural gas side, this event shook everybody's exposure and expectation of risk significantly. And so the big gas utilities in particular have made significant changes in their contracting strategies, in their storage contracts, in their baseload gas purchasing strategies. So it's difficult, and we haven't found the answer yet to avoid all exposure to the daily physical gas market, because it's very difficult to predict exactly how much gas you need to buy on any day. And if you don't know how much gas you're gonna buy, then it's difficult to hedge or come up with a financial instrument to ensure that you won't incur those costs. But our gas utilities are better prepared for sure, and would not experience the same degree of financial stress or the same financial ramifications or consequences if we had another exact repeat of Winter Storm Uri. Now, some of the smaller ones, you know, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of answers. I mean, they don't have, you know, if you're only connected to one interstate gas pipeline and you serve 186 customers, you know, those utilities may very well still be exposed. And that's, you know, an unfortunate reality for them. And, you know, we've got to still continue to think about that. But, and there wasn't, you know, it seems like, well, years gone by, but it was the fastest year of my life for sure. And, you know, we did what we could with the amount of time that we had and the budgets that we had, commission approved budgets. So I think we're in better shape for this winter.
Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to make a quick comment that I thought about as I heard the question about how, you know, what do we want to do to prepare? And I hope that we consider energy efficiency, especially in human need cases, as a way to reduce that load so that we are better prepared.
And if there's no more questions, I just have a couple real quick ones, Justin, because I appreciate the committee's indulgence on the time. If we weren't pro forma, we'd have been out of here 10 minutes ago. How many outstanding cases are left that you, or are all of the cases that you guys are dealing with on these various cases, you're dealing with them now?
We are. So, I did go through, you know, some of the specifics in there, but so for Black Hills, for instance, we filed a settlement with the commission. That settlement is pending before the commission now. We have the agreement was to allow the recovery of those costs over a 5-year period of time. For Atmos Energy, they're still pending. You know, we basically address these in the order in which they came in, right? And so we have settlement, technical discussions that start up, testimony and whatnot with Atmos later this month. KGS, we filed a settlement with all parties but one. That's before the commission. We have hearings. We had one hearing with that. We have another hearing January 19th and 20th pertaining to KGS. Southern Pioneer Electric Company is a regulated, not-for-profit utility that's owned by a cooperative. They're in western Kansas. You know, they incurred $17 million of SPP, integrated marketplace costs. We've recommended approval of their plan with a few tweaks, and now we're waiting on them to file a response. So that one's pending before the commission. And American Energies in the city of Eskridge, we did quite early, and those have been approved by the commission now. Evergy, we're going to file our report and recommendation for them this week. Evergy Kansas Central, they incurred a little over $135 million of energy costs. Their request is for around $5 a month customer impact for 2 years. But the sister company, Evergy Kansas Metro, the old KCPL system, they actually benefited during the event. They had a little over $41 million of benefit, and they are recommending giving back that benefit over, it's $9.70 a month per residential customer over 1 year. Our recommendation is, why don't you give it back over the same period of time as Evergy Kansas Central to kind of keep that rate differential relatively similar. So we're going to file that recommendation, anytime. And then Empire District Electric Company has yet to file their plan with us, but that is imminent as well, and it's coming soon. So I don't know. We're making progress, but I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel yet. So
It's going to be a while, I think. We could probably talk about this for another hour, but no, I don't
sure we
want
could.
don't want to hold up the committee. And I'm certain as new information comes in, you'll just provide it to us and we can share it with the committee. I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. And, we're always available. I mean, we are busy. There's a lot on, it's already prearranged on the calendar, the docket calendar with hearings and testimony and whatnot. But, sincerely, we welcome any questions that the committee has at any time. You guys know how to get a hold of us. Just reach out and we'll do our best to help provide the information.
Appreciate it very much. I know there's a lot of people impacted by this across the state. A lot of people upset over the high prices and don't want to see this, repeat of this anytime soon. So we appreciate you guys looking into it, and I'm sure that you'll be in touch with that. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Committee, if you'll just indulge me a moment, are there any bill requests for bills or bill introductions today? Seeing none, I do have three, if I could read them in very quickly. It'd be 22 RS 2479, and that is an act relating to wind and solar facilities requiring appropriate zoning, establishing protest procedures for county zoning resolutions, and requirements for recording of wind and solar energy leases. Do I have any objections on the introduction of that bill? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Okay, that bill is introduced. Second bill is 22 RS 2355. This is relating to easements and leases involving wind and solar resources and technologies, providing circumstances for termination of such instruments and amending KSA 2021 supplement 58-2272 and repealing the existing section of that. Any objections on that bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. And the final bill, 22 RS 2354, that's an act concerning wind and solar leases and easements, providing certain requirements for such conveyances and requiring execution of a facility agreement with the landowner. Any objections to the introduction of that? Seeing none, we will introduce that. On a normal basis, we'll try to be out of here by 2:25, committee, to respect your time, get us down to the floor in time in most cases. And if you will, just let Sheila or I know if you're going to be significantly late so we know if we can conduct business. But I appreciate that very much. And again, anybody online, we will post all of our testimony and information online for the availability there. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.